Vyvanse, the drug literally designed to treat ADHD. But is it just as effective? And what are some of the pros and cons in comparison to other treatments? Now, as a drug scientist, I made this TikTok to answer your weird drug questions, but I never expected most of them to be, hey, just tell me about these ADHD medications that I'm on. But there's no judgment. I understand that. Over 1 million people, for example, take Vyvanse, and so you should know what's happening with the medication that you're on. Now, you should also talk to your doctor about these things, because as a reminder, I'm a PhD, not an MD, and I can tell you all about the science, but I'm not telling you what to take. But I am very happy to keep talking about ADHD medications, although I must admit I am running out of the ones to talk about. So if you have weird drug questions, feel free to send those in too. Here are the important scientific facts about Vyvanse. So Vyvanse is a stimulant ADHD medication. It's actually very similar to Addy and Ret, but it works differently from those in that it is a prodrug. So what does it mean to be a prodrug? A prodrug just basically means that the drug is not actually active until it's converted or broken down in your system. So in the case of Vyvanse, which is lisdexamfetamine, Vyvanse is broken down into lysine and dextroamphetamine. And dextroamphetamine is one of the two major components of Addy. So it works very similar to those other stimulants out there, but it is somewhat different in terms of its formulation. Because it is a prodrug and is broken down into not just dextroamphetamine, but also lysine, that means that it's boosting the amount of lysine in your system. And we know that lysine is somehow linked to ADHD. Now, we don't exactly know how. So the most recent review that I read about this was from last year and basically said lysine is linked to ADHD. We see that there are low lysine levels in people with ADHD, but we don't know necessarily what that means. Maybe ADHD is making those lysine levels low, or maybe those lysine levels are low, which makes people more likely to have ADHD, so we might be able to use lysine as a treatment for ADHD. We don't know yet. That's one of the great mysteries about ADHD. And there's a lot of ADHD that's just unexplored. So for example, my favorite question of why do people with ADHD feel like caffeine makes them tired? Barely studied. Someone give me money to fund that. Now, the other interesting part about Vyvanse being a prodrug is that it is less likely to be addictive. So prodrugs typically produce kind of more gradual, longer lasting effects versus that kind of immediate rush or immediate euphoria that you might get from other stimulants like Addy. And so that prodrug might make it less likely to be addictive. The way that Vyvanse is made means that even if you snort or inject it, which for other drugs makes them more likely to produce an immediate high and thus more likely to be addictive, even if you use it in those different routes of administration, that's not really doing much of anything for Vyvanse. So it's still not going to produce an immediate high, and it's still not going to make you want to continue using it for those illegal euphoric reasons. Illegal euphoria would also be a great band name. Now, we see different effects for the animal models. So we see that rats will actually self-administer it, so they will give themselves this drug, suggesting that it's at least somewhat reinforcing. And we do see that both rats and monkeys will say that the kind of interoceptive effects, so the feeling that your body gets when you take a drug, that is very similar to what people are feeling for those other stimulants out there, as well as for things like blow. Now, why do some people use Vyvanse instead of the other drugs? So one of the reasons is that it might be less addictive. That is one of the major concerns about stimulants out there. So if Vyvanse is less addictive, then that's a plus in its column. It's also relatively safe. So it might be less likely to produce an overdose in comparison to things like Addy and Ret. And there are fewer interactions, so you're less likely to have problems with things like taking Tums while you're on that medication. Although it is still a problem during pregnancy, and it also might have interactions with MAOIs as well. So you still need to be cautious when you're taking it, which is true of every medication that you take, including supplements. And it does have some problems. Now, these are problems that are pretty common amongst the other stimulant ADHD medication too. So these are things like growth issues for children. So we do see that children who are given ADHD meds have a kind of slower growth trajectory than people who are not on ADHD medication. And this seems like it is specifically occurring during the first 2 years, and then it kind of plateaus after that. And in general, if you have cardiovascular problems, you probably shouldn't be taking stimulants. They are not good for your system. Also, if you're sensitive to stimulants, as somebody who has severe anxiety, I don't like taking stimulants, not even the stuff that's over the counter for things like the flu. First, because it doesn't work, but second, because it makes me feel terrible because the stimulants actually increase my anxiety. Now, there are all sorts of other side effects that people claim, but not many of them are actually supported by the science, even though AI loves to tell you that they're true. So the first one is that Vyvanse might decrease sexual maturation. And we have seen this in rats, But rats are different from humans, and we still need this human research. Now, I will say it is incredibly difficult to do this research because then you're attempting to give people Vyvanse right before puberty, so you're giving children Vyvanse, and you want to see if it changes their sexual maturation. Like, you can't do an ethical study on this, but we still need to see reports of this in humans because rats and humans are obviously very different. Now, AI likes to talk about all of these other very bad side effects of Vyvanse, so that it increases aggression, and that it might cause some of these same long-term problems that the little blue pill does. And it could also potentially cause Raynaud's syndrome, which is when you kind of lose circulation to your hands. But there is nothing basically out there about this. There's a couple of case studies. There's like one on the erection side of things, and there's like 2 mentioned for the aggression side of things. Like, this is not good data. Now, because Vyvanse works so well for things like ADHD, we're also using it to treat a variety of other things. And there have been pilot studies for quite a few things. So things like depression and bipolar, and even things like bulimia. But it seems like it might be going places for things like stimulant addiction, so blow and even crystal, and also things like binge eating disorder. It actually shows really good results for binge eating disorder. It reduces the symptomology, and it also does things like increases weight loss. We don't have a lot on like stimulant addiction, so if it can help with things like blow or crystal use. But there was a randomized controlled study that said that, it might actually work for crystal addiction. Now, it had a relatively small effect in comparison, but the problem is that this addiction is incredibly difficult to treat. So, for example, in the randomized controlled trial that was run on it, 9 people quit before the study even began. And others show that up to about 40% of people are quitting, and that's those who have actually said that they're willing to do it. It is incredibly hard to find participants for this type of research. Scientists formulated this new drug to treat ADHD. It works decently well. It seems to do everything it's supposed to. It doesn't produce the high, maybe less addictive, not as bad as side effects, and maybe it can be used to treat other things too. Vyvanse, pretty good.